The writer would need to take her interpretation one step further by answering the question, what does the story say is lost and what is gained when you move yourself up out of poverty? One answer to that question might read like this. According to Walker's story, poverty, suffering, and degradation produce the richest cultural artifacts, and ironically, transcending those socioeconomic conditions robs a culture of its vitality. Some readers might disagree with that interpretation. They might think, for example, that the story demonstrates that a community's culture can only be preserved by people who rise up through education and prosperity. It helps to imagine that your audience is comprised of readers who disagree with your thesis, and that your job is to change their minds. Usually, you'll find your best articulation of your interpretation in that concluding paragraph of your rough draft. That's because it is often during the act of writing that first draft that you figure out what it is you want to prove to readers. Look at that conclusion. Is it debatable? Is it something that people will disagree with? Is it worth writing a whole paper to prove that point? If not, then you need to work on it some more. At this stage, you must have a solid thesis statement. Put that thesis statement at the head of a new outline. So, yes, this process that you're being encouraged to use suggests to you that most likely you're going to come up with your thesis after you've produced the draft, and if you try very hard, your thesis is going to end up in your conclusion. And if that is so, then that's great, because then you can take that conclusion, that piece of it, and you can start your paper with it. Outlining. Now, ask yourself, what do I need to do to prove that I'm probably right? You're trying to map out the steps in your argument. Remember that the thesis governs all. For example, let's consider, again, that thesis about everyday use. According to Walker's story, the experience of communal suffering, struggle, and degradation can produce a rich culture, and escaping that oppression can kill that culture's vitality. Our writer's outline might look like this. Demonstrate how the narrator's family grew up disadvantaged and discriminated against, right? Because if you look back to that thesis statement, the expression communal suffering, you've got to prove it. That's the first element in the thesis, so that has to be proven first. Point 2, prove that the family expressed itself through the very objects it used in the struggle to survive and prosper in this atmosphere. Okay? Can produce a rich culture. You see that part of the thesis right there. That's part 2, so it gets proven in the second point of your outline. 3, show how Dee has raised herself above the socioeconomic situation that stifled the family. 4, demonstrate how Dee's treatment of the family objects strips them of their vitality. 5, demonstrate how impoverished Dee's life actually is. And you can see that each of these points is the natural outgrowth of points 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the thesis statement. The thesis statement is a map of the paper. Okay. Each of those bullet points is one stage in an argument, bringing the reader closer to agreeing with the thesis. Think of these points as train stations along your reader's journey. The train has to pass through the first station before it can get to the second, and so on. In this case, our writer first will prove that this family of farmers has suffered deprivations imposed by white supremacism. Her readers must be persuaded of that point before she can go on to discuss how the family expressed itself artistically through the objects of farm life, and only then can she go on to the third point. Each point follows its precedent in a logical, necessary sequence, and the destination at the end of this sequence of train stations is your thesis. Once you've written a sequence of bullet points, you need to gather evidence to support each one. Most of your evidence will come from the text of the story itself. Let's imagine you're thinking about how to prove the second bullet point in my example, that Dee's family expressed itself through the very objects it used in its struggle to survive and prosper. You might pay careful attention to the butter churner's dasher, how Dee recognizes that it could be an object of art put on display, and then how its beauty derives from the small sinks in the wood of the handle, and how those sinks were made by generations of thumbs and fingers working the dasher. In other words, you would be discussing how the dasher symbolizes the hard work and suffering of people who, even in the mid-20th century, churned their butter by hand with objects they carved from trees in their own yard. You would be analyzing elements of the story, in this case a symbol, and you'd either quote or paraphrase the text of the story to do so. That's your evidence. Each paragraph in your argument should point to specific details from the story. Redrafting. Now you're ready to write your second draft. Open an entirely new word processing document, a completely blank page. This will prevent you from merely tinkering with that first draft, adding a few sentences, moving paragraphs around, editing for grammar and usage, polishing the style. Though the work you put into the rough draft was absolutely essential, only through writing that draft could you discover what you have to say. The purpose of that first draft was to help you develop your ideas. You were the audience. You wrote it in order to communicate something to yourself. Your second draft is a public document. Your audience is someone else, perhaps your fellow classmates, the general public, your teacher, or an imaginary, thoughtful literary critic. Above all, imagine that your readers are people who disagree with your thesis. In revision, you start making rhetorical decisions based on how you want to affect that audience, which calls for a fresh start. Using your new outline, write the second draft of your paper in this blank document. Each of your bullet points might serve as the main point of one of the body paragraphs. You might end up cutting and pasting significant portions of your rough draft. That's perfectly fine, but I think you'll probably find that while you're using ideas from the first draft, there are very few complete sentences and practically no paragraphs that can be cut and pasted wholesale into the second draft. The second draft is a true rewriting. You're writing the paper a second time. All the while, you need to be thinking about your audience. Will this idea be clear to my reader, or do I need to explain it a little more fully? Is my argument convincing to a skeptical reader? What do I need to do to improve it? Only after redrafting do I recommend you write your introduction. Now you know exactly what you want to prove to your readers, and you know exactly how you're going to do it. So only now are you ready to craft an introduction that sets all of that up for your readers. Think of the introduction as having three purposes. 1, to grab your reader's interest. 2, to introduce the relevant theme you're discussing. And 3, to deliver your thesis. More often than not, the best way to accomplish these is to open with a vivid scene, something that engages your reader's imagination. For example, in the paper we've been discussing above, which deals with the themes of oppression and art, you might begin by painting a scene that dramatizes the conflict between prosperity and cultural vitality. At the end of Alice Walker's Everyday Use, the story's narrator, a mother, must choose between her daughters. 1, Maggie, is a victim, scarred physically by fire and emotionally by a hard life of poverty and racial oppression. She is shy, self-effacing, and not really able to rise to the challenges of her difficult life. The other daughter, Dee, has insisted on advancing herself, and by dint of her own tenacity has escaped the legacy of subsistence farm life. Years later, she has come home to visit, and she wants her mother to give her a treasured family heirloom, 2 quilts pieced by their grandmother, from whom she is named. Dee would save the quilts from everyday use and preserve them as works of folk art and put them on display. The mother chooses to give the quilts to Maggie, even at the price of their eventual disintegration. According to Walker's story, it is the experience of communal suffering, struggle, and degradation that produces rich culture, and escaping that oppression can kill the culture's vitality. Stage 5 of the writing process, editing. Editing means polishing your arguments. Read through your revision. Try to imagine you're someone who disagrees with the thesis. Go from beginning to end, marking up the revision. Don't stop to fix anything yet. Just identify all of the problems. Look for places in your logic that are weak or unconvincing. Do you need more evidence someplace? Does it seem odd that paragraph 3 leads into paragraph 4? Do several sentences within one paragraph seem to be unrelated to that paragraph's main purpose? After you've marked the entire paper, correct these problems. Don't be afraid to change things pretty significantly in the editing process. You might find yourself moving several sentences from one paragraph to another. You might cut out chunks of the paper that are unrelated to your thesis. You might even tweak your thesis, in which case you need to reassess everything to make sure the paper still relates to it. Maybe you'll realize that before you get to point X, you have to write a whole new paragraph. Editing can be pretty labor-intensive, even if it does not rise to the level of a full revision.